the reason God brought Israel out of Egypt was not just to give them the law. He didn't save them so they could have a list of things that they needed to do, right? The purpose was to dwell with them. We see that in a verse I've already spoken about, 24 verse 46. And they shall know that I am the Lord who brought them out of the land, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. The purpose of bringing them out is shown by that connector, that God wants to dwell with his people. And so, but this is why we have to understand the placing of chapters 20 to 24. Chapters 20 to 24 is where Israel agrees to this covenant and says, yes, we will live as your people if you will be our God. And as a result of them saying yes, the next chapter is 25, where God gives them the tabernacle plans. The tabernacle, which we'll go through in detail in this session, is God's, basically his tent in the midst of the people. It's the place where he's going to dwell. But notice, they had to agree to the covenant before God would dwell with them. We see later on in the Old Testament, another analogy. We've been using this analogy of God as a father and Israel as his son. Not analogy, but a metaphor. Another metaphor that God uses to describe his relationship with his people is like a husband and wife. And so, in a real sense, they've said yes to this covenant, and then God dwells with them. They move in together. And so this is the purpose, right? God wants to be in their midst, but for him to be in their midst, they need to say, yes, we will live a certain way. Yes to the covenant. And so that's the flow of the book, right? You have covenant that they say yes to at the end of, in the middle of chapter 24, right? 24 verse 2, it says, all the words, in verse 2, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Okay? And so as a result, then God says, okay, then I will join myself to this people. Now, again, to become the people of God, even in the Old Testament, is not based off of ethnicity primarily, right? Because it was a mixed multitude that left Egypt. And so to become part of the people of God is you need to leave Egypt, say yes to the covenant, and then you dwell with the Almighty God. So let's go through the tabernacle. Now this can be a little bit of a complicated part to work through because it doesn't seem too applicable, right? It's the blueprint. It's the building plans. What does it matter to us that thing is this long and that color? But we're going to try to look for meaning that we can associate it with. Now there's three ways that we can go about this. First is, what did these items mean to the Israelites, right? As they looked at them, they wouldn't have been like, that makes no sense. Why would God want us to do that? It would make perfect sense to them. And they would have meaning attributed to it. Then beyond that, what did the New Testament writers think of these? What did the New Testament writers think these things represented? Because for sure they represented a little bit more than they did at that time. And then lastly, what significance did God invest in these objects? Hebrews 8:4 says that this is just a sketch of the heavenly one. So this is just there's definitely significance that God has added to the tabernacle that Israel, they're not going to understand it looking right at it. But there will be some meaning that they can get out of it. And so we're going to spend more time looking through not so much the lens of the New Testament or even the lens of God, because that's rather difficult, but we'll take the historical and literary context, and we should get rather close to understanding what Israel thought each of these items represented. At the beginning, it can be a little bit repetitive, and the reason being is from chapter 25 up to 30 and 31 is where they get the plans for the tabernacle. And then from 35, I believe, onwards is where they actually build the tabernacle, and they build it according to the plan. And so at the beginning of each of the plans is always the Holy of Holies and the items in the Holy of Holies, because that's the most important part, okay? So the Holy of Holies was the room where God's presence would dwell, and it was separated by a curtain, right? A very thick curtain, and the only item woven onto that curtain was a cherubim. This is to remind us back in Genesis chapter 3, where God places a cherubim blocking the way back to the tree of life, blocking the way back to his presence. And so cherubim are these guardians of God's presence. Within the Holy of Holies, you have two items. You have the Ark of the Covenant, and on top of the Ark of the Covenant, you have the mercy seat. Now, this is the throne where God sits. This is where his presence sits enthroned on the mercy seat. Because God is the king of the people. We saw that in chapter 15 in the Song of Moses, the Lord will reign forever and ever. He is our king. And we'll see how that's the primary distinction that sets Israel apart from the other nations, of who sits on their throne. And for the original readers, the Israelites, it would have been clear to them that this is where their king sits. This is his throne room. And in this sense, the tabernacle, and there's a few other ways to go about it, but the tabernacle is like a returning to the garden, right? If the garden was where God's presence dwelt with human beings, now, in a sense, that's happened again. God's presence is dwelling in the midst of human beings. And so even for the Israelites, they would have felt like the tabernacle is like a miniature garden. And there's many more parallels that you can draw that would prove that that's the view they would have had. Then moving outwards from the Holy of Holies, you have the holy place. And in the holy place, you have three items. You have on one wall, you have the table of the bread of the presence. On the opposing wall, you have the lampstand. And then right in the middle, you have the altar of incense. The table of the bread of the presence, that's that same word as have no other gods before me, right? Before my face. You had 12 loaves, right? 2 stacks of 6 loaves. This is now in chapter 25, verses 30 to 30. Now, in the Old Testament, when you would make a covenant, you would ratify it with a meal, right? Abraham has meals with people he makes a covenant with. And you see back in chapter 24, after the people of Israel has agreed to a covenant, notice 24 verse 11. The elders go up to God. At the end of verse 11, they beheld God and they ate and drank, right? Because you confirm the covenant by having a meal together. And so these breads, 6 of them, 2 stacks of 6, 12 of them for each of the 12 tribes of Israel is a remember of that commitment meal that we've had, committing to this covenant. And they're meant to be there always, right? They replace them. I think it's each a week, but they're meant to be a continual remembrance of this covenant that we've agreed to. Then on the other side, you have the lampstand. And I'm going to argue that this reminds me of the covenant just in a different way, right? So to agree to a covenant, you need to make an oath, which is, again, what we see in chapter 24. The oath that they make is in verse 3 of chapter 24. They say, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And then again, they say it in verse 7. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Okay, so that's the oath. Now, the Hebrew word for oath is very similar to the Hebrew word for 7. A very important word in the Old Testament. And we see this kind of interchanging playing out in Genesis chapter 21. If you flip there, Genesis chapter 21, Moses makes an agreement with Abimelech, a king living in Canaan, and they're arguing over whose well is it. Okay? And so they make a covenant, and you can see the key word there in verse 27. Okay? Abimelech and Abraham make a covenant. Okay? And then in verse 31 and 32, it says, therefore that place shall be called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath, and so they made a covenant at Beersheba. Now, Beer is well, and Sheba is 7. Okay? But it could also be translated as not well of 7, but well of oath. Well of oath, agreeing to this covenant. And so when we come to the tabernacle, and Israel has a candle of 7 branches, that would remind them of the word Sheba, which is very similar to the word oath. reminding of them that this oath that they've made to say yes to the covenant. Again, the same reminder as the bread. So you have these two items that remind them of the covenant that they've agreed to that allows them into the presence of God. Then right in the middle, you have the altar of incense. Now this is relatively straightforward. Many ancient religions had incense in their temples, and the purpose of the incense was to be symbolic of prayers going up to their gods. In the Old Testament, there's several passages like that, Psalm 141 verse 2, and even in the New Testament, they talk about incense going up as prayers. Another purpose of this, because it being right in the middle, it would add kind of smoke in front of the curtain dividing the holy place from the Holy of Holies, so that not even by accident could you get a glimpse of God's glorious presence inside the Holy of Holies. And then it was to protect them even more. The altar of incense were also given the instructions on what kind of incense they were to make. We're given all the list of ingredients, right? And it's interesting items. And again, one of my favorite Bible teachers, he would say that he looked into this, and the incense that they were to make was just out of common stuff that they would find in the Sinai Peninsula, which is where they are, like different trees and different herbs that they could find. And as they researched it, because God commands them specifically not to replicate this incense for themselves, okay? And we don't really know why, but it's labeled as a punishable offense if they make the same incense. And it's not because it was very valuable. And so different people have researched this and says that that same incense was used by people in the wilderness all the time. Okay, now the question is, what did they use it for? Now, I don't know if you live in a country where they have lots of mosquitoes. My country, Canada, we definitely have a lot. And when we go camping, oftentimes we'll burn kind of this green coil to put off incense, and it's supposed to repel the mosquitoes away from our campsite. That's what sources say this incense was used for, not to repel mosquitoes, but we see even later on in Numbers that the Sinai wilderness is full of poisonous vipers. And so God is commanding them not to replicate an incense that would protect them from poisonous vipers. That incense can only be burned in one tent in the camp, and that's the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. Well, why is that? It's because the wilderness is a place of testing. It's the same reason for the manna every single day. And it's because imagine a Hebrew mother or father laying their child to bed at night in their tent and then not burning incense to protect them from the poisonous snakes that are right outside, but trusting that Yahweh won't only be their provider of food, but also their protector. Incredible act of faith. And if you do that for 40 years, you're going to be sure that God is a sufficient protector. Moving onwards, we come out of the holy place into the courtyard. And in the courtyard, this is the widest part. There's two items. Right in front of the tent, you have the bronze basin, a massive bowl full of water, and you have the bronze altar on the other side of it. The bronze altar, this is in chapter 27. This is relatively straightforward for the Israelite people. It would display sacrifice, right? And the sacrifices they had seen before is the sacrifice at Passover, and the sacrifices that they learn about in the book of Leviticus. And so it's a place where their sin is paid for. If you break the covenant, then it's a covenant that you've agreed to with your life. And so if you break that covenant, your life is required of you. And so they would sacrifice animals to receive forgiveness for their breaking of the covenant, and the animal would die instead of them. And that's for sure what the Israelites would have thought as they looked at the bronze altar. Then's the bronze basin. That would have been used for the priests to wash themselves before entering into the presence of God. And again, for the original readers, pretty straightforward. The priest would have to be clean in order to go into the presence of God after offering the sacrifices. Now, there's a few kind of overarching observations we can make of this section. The access to God gets progressively limited as you get closer and closer to his presence. The courtyard, anybody can go in there at any point of the year, right? But from the altar backwards to the holy place, that's only the priests, but also every day of the year. Then when you get to the Holy of Holies, that's only the high priest and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. And so the access before God gets more and more limited the closer you get to his presence. Another way to view that is the minerals that are used, or the elements that are used for the construction. On the outside, it's bronze, which is a little bit of a mixture. And as closer and closer you get to the presence of God, they use solid gold. Now, something interesting that we can observe is that actually the tabernacle plans, what they actually do is they tell the story of Exodus thus far. And when Israel would look at it, they would consistently be reminded of their story. Now follow me here on this. The bronze altar, that's the sacrifice. That can be equivalent to the Passover, the sacrifice that set them free. Then after, if you're walking towards the Holy of Holies, after the altar, you go to the bronze basin where you wash before you can go in. Israel, after they had the Passover lamb, the sacrifice, they go into the Red Sea. Then in the tabernacle, after the bronze basin, you go into the holy place, which is a reminder of the covenant, right? The lampstand with 7 branches and the table of the bread of the presence reminds them of their oath and the meal they shared, ratifying that covenant. Now, when Israel passes through the Red Sea and comes out the other side, the next step in the narrative is also covenant. That's where they make a covenant agreement with Yahweh. Then in the tabernacle, after the holy place, remembering the covenant, you go into the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God dwells. Then you go in there, and you're in the presence of God, which was Israel. As soon as they made the covenant with Yahweh in the wilderness, then God comes and dwells with them. So from Passover to Red Sea to covenant to the Mount Sinai tabernacle, you have the story played out in the tabernacle with the bronze altar, the bronze basin, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. And it was a way for them to remember their story. So when they enter into Canaan and they have the tabernacle, it reminds them of how they got there. And it reminds them that collectively as a nation, they dwell in the presence of God. Now, the most of the later part of Exodus from 19 onwards is focusing on the covenant and the tabernacle. But right in the middle, we already looked at it, we come to this very interesting story of the worship of the golden calf. And like I said in the last session, they're not breaking the first commandment. They're not worshiping other gods, but they're breaking the second commandment. They're worshiping the Lord by using an image. And so when Moses comes down off the mountain, we're now in Exodus chapter 32, verse 19. When he comes down off of the mountain and he sees what they're doing, he breaks the tablets that have the law written on it. And it's not just because he's angry and frustrated, and that was like the closest thing to him where his anger could kind of be directed. No, it's because he was symbolizing to the people, showing them what they've done. They've literally broken that covenant agreement. And so the very moment they've said yes to God, in a matter of moments, they break that covenant in the larger narrative. It's very quick. And so God sends a plague on them, and it ends up killing about 3,000 in Exodus 32, verse 28. And God commands them then to leave, to depart, and go into the land. But then in 33, verse 3, there's an important contrast. God says, go, you can still have the land, but I am not going with you. And that triggers Moses to go up to the mountain and make intercession with Yahweh. Actually, sorry, not up to the mountain, but in a place of meeting that Moses has with the Lord, to make intercession, to implore the Lord to go with them. This is now in chapter 33. verse 15 and 16. Moses says, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here." Then 16 is our connector, 4. The reason why Moses does not want to leave Mount Sinai without the presence of God is because, "For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from all the other people on the face of the earth?" Think about this for a second. They had 613 laws. Their clothing looked different. Their farming looked different. Their family relationships looked different. But the thing that set them apart the most was not those things. The things that set them apart the most from the other nations was the presence of God dwelling with them. The statement that Yahweh is our king and we are his people, and he sits there enthroned in the tabernacle. That was the most defining difference. It's the same for us today. The thing that sets you apart from other non-believers in the world is the fact that God's presence dwells with you. That's your primary distinction. And then after that, it's how you live your life, motivated out of that right relationship. And so Moses implores the Lord to go with him because he knows, if you're not with us, then we're no different. We're no different than the other nations. That's what sets us apart. And then in 17, Moses asks for proof that God will go with him. Okay? And it's very interesting, the wording that's used. In verse 18, observe the word glory, right? Moses asks to see God's glory. And then in verse 19, God doesn't say, "I'll make my glory pass before you," right? He says, "I'll make my goodness pass before you." Okay? "And as I do that, I will proclaim my name." Okay? And so God's name is his goodness, and his goodness is his glory, is how we're meant to connect these. And then in verse 22 it says, "My glory will pass before you," which he just said in verse 19 that his goodness would pass before. So God's name is his goodness, and his goodness is his glory. Now let's see when that actually happens. Okay? That's chapter 34. Verse 5, the Lord descends on the mountain, and he proclaims the name of the Lord, meaning he's proclaiming his goodness. He's proclaiming his glory. And look at what he proclaims. This is very important for the rest of the Old Testament. Verse 6, "The Lord passed before him and proclaimed," and you need to observe the list in this section. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of their fathers on their children and their children's children to the third and fourth generation." Okay? An incredible list there, but normally we gravitate to the end part and say, well, that's rather unjust, God. You're visiting your judgment on the children. Their father sinned, and you're still visiting judgment on them. Now that's an interpretation that is not correct because it contradicts later scriptures, right? There's a passage in Ezekiel where God says the father will not be punished for the sins of his son, nor will the son be punished for the sins of his father. So that's not what it means. Rather, I think it's a way of God emphasizing his graciousness. On your notes there, write the number 1,000. And then next to it, write the number 3 to 4. Because God says that the positive list, right? Merciful, gracious, steadfast love, faithfulness, keeping steadfast love. He does those for thousands of generations. Thousands and thousands of generations. This is God's goodness. But for 3 to 4 generations, he will judge. So it's to show not that he's going to judge children for the sins of their father, but it's to show that God's judgment is so small in comparison to his graciousness. Of course he will judge, but it's not permanent. It's momentary. What's permanent is his graciousness and his merciful. And you see that in the narrative, right? God does judge the people. 3,000 die in one day. But then what goes on forever is Israel is still the people of God. So his judgment came and it was momentary, but he walked with them forever. Now, again, remember at the beginning of the book, When Moses says, okay, you're the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, in chapter 3, the burning bush scene. And he says, but what's your name? And God says, I am who I am. And like we said, that could also mean I will be who I will be who I will be. Meaning, come out from Egypt and I will show you who I am. That connects to chapter 34 when God tells Moses he will proclaim his name. But this time he's not proclaiming I am, right? He is in a way. He is in verse 6, he's saying the Lord. And that comes from the phrase I am. But then he adds more explanation. I am a God of mercy, of gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, faithfulness, keeping steadfast love. This is more who God is showing himself to be, right? So now they have an experience. It's not just God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the God that we've met for ourselves. And the primary thing he wants us to know about him, his goodness, his character, his glory, is that he's merciful and gracious. The context should not be lost on us because they've just walked away from the Lord on, if you will, their honeymoon, right? They've said yes to a covenant. God dwells with them, and right away they break the covenant. But God responds in great mercy and graciousness to them. They are definitely coming to learn who Yahweh is and how differently he is from the nations around them. The story concludes rather abruptly. They build the tabernacle. And then in 40 verse 34, as soon as they finish the work, then it says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Now, the glory of the Lord, his goodness, his character was up on the mountain that Moses was in. Now, when they build the tabernacle, God's presence moves from the mountain into the midst of the people, accomplishing the purpose that they set out for, that God rescued them from Egypt, that I might dwell in their midst. The tabernacle, one commentator put as this, the tabernacle represents the presence of God in fulfillment of his covenantal pledge. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. God has put himself in the midst of his people so that when the nations look at Israel, they see God and man dwelling together, and it's meant to be evangelistic, that they're also invited into that as they see the fruit of that incredible relationship. Now, as soon as God lands in the tabernacle, he then speaks out of the tabernacle. And what he speaks out of the tabernacle is actually the book of Leviticus, right? How you're meant to live now as clean people because the holy God is in your midst. I hope you've enjoyed our journey through the book of Exodus. It's the journey of God with his people. And in this same way, we find our own journey in that story, right? We all were, like Israel, enslaved to our sin, serving our own masters, serving ourselves, as opposed to serving Yahweh, and that ends with our enslavement. But because of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, we're released, we're set free, we're made new, we're made sons of God. And as a result, we say yes to that covenant. Say, yes, I will live as the people of God. And then when that happens, God dwells within us. And we learn about that in the New Testament. We become like living stones, the dwelling place of God. And so our story is Israel's story, provided we leave Egypt and walk in accordance to that covenant. Such a remarkable story.